The jungle was silent except for his breathing. Harold Wilson pressed his back against the muddy ridge wall, feeling the weight of 18 rifle magazines in his pack. 18 magazines, 900 rounds, against what the intelligence officer estimated as at least 2 companies of Japanese infantry moving up the slope below. The math was simple and terrifying. He would run out of bullets long before they ran out of men. His commanding officer had called this position defensible for exactly 4 hours, maybe 5 if God was generous. Wilson looked at his watch. It was 0347 hours, September 14th, 1943, on a nameless ridge in New Guinea that would decide whether the entire battalion's left flank collapsed before dawn. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Nobody remembers Harold Wilson today. No medals were pinned on his chest in public ceremonies. No historians wrote his name in the official accounts of the New Guinea campaign. But on that September morning, on a muddy ridge that barely appeared on tactical maps, Wilson held a position that doctrine said required at least a full platoon. He held it alone, not because he was ordered to, not because he was particularly brave, but because every other man assigned to that ridge was either dead or bleeding out in the aid station 2 miles behind the line. Wilson was a replacement, fresh from a logistics company, a man who had fired his rifle in combat exactly 3 times before that night. He was 22 years old, from a lumber town in Oregon, and he had learned to shoot by hunting deer in forests, so thick you rarely saw your target until it was within 30 yards. That skill, learned in childhood, would become the difference between survival and annihilation for 800 men sleeping in their positions below. The ridge itself was unremarkable. A volcanic spine jutting from the jungle floor, roughly 80 yards long, covered in ferns and rotting logs. It overlooked a narrow valley that served as the only supply route to the forward American positions. Lose the ridge, and Japanese mortars could cut that route to pieces. Lose the route, and the entire battalion would be surrounded, cut off from ammunition, food, and medical evacuation. The Japanese knew this. Their intelligence was good. They had spent 3 days probing the American defenses, testing response times, mapping firing positions. They knew the ridge was lightly defended. They knew tonight was a night to take it. Wilson had arrived on the ridge at 2,100 hours the previous evening, part of a hastily assembled 8-man squad sent to reinforce what was supposed to be a full platoon position. When they arrived, they found only corpses. The platoon had been overrun 2 hours earlier in a silent knife attack that left no survivors and no warning shots. The bodies were still warm. Wilson's squad leader, a sergeant from Tennessee named Dockery, immediately radioed for instructions. The response was clear and cold. Hold the position until dawn. Reinforcements would arrive with first light. Just hold until dawn. They had barely started digging in when the mortars began. Not the heavy bombardment that announces a major assault, but precise, targeted fire that suggested experienced forward observers. The first round killed Dockery instantly, a direct hit that left nothing identifiable. The second round collapsed the fighting position on the right flank, burying 2 men under logs and mud. Wilson and the remaining 4 soldiers scattered, diving into whatever cover they could find. For 90 minutes, the mortars walked back and forth across the ridge with methodical precision. No wasted shells. Each round carefully placed the destroyed positions, break morale, and forced defenders into the open. When the mortars finally stopped, Wilson emerged from beneath a fallen tree to find himself alone. 2 men were dead. 2 were badly wounded and crawling toward the rear. 1 had simply vanished, either blown apart or fled into the jungle. Wilson was the only man on the ridge still capable of fighting. He should have retreated. Every tactical manual, every training exercise, every piece of common sense said that 1 man could not hold a position designed for 40. But Wilson had heard the radio traffic. He knew what losing this ridge meant. He knew that 800 men, including his friends from the logistics company, were sleeping in positions that would become death traps if Japanese mortars gained this high ground. So he made a decision that defied orders, defied doctrine, and defied survival instinct. He stayed. Wilson moved along the ridge in the darkness, gathering ammunition from the dead. He worked quickly, methodically, forcing himself not to look at faces. 18 magazines for his M1 Garand. For fragmentation grenades, 1 thermite grenade. A bandolier round for a bar that he found lying next to its dead operator, though Wilson had never fired a Browning automatic rifle in his life and didn't trust himself to use it effectively. He stuck with what he knew. The Garand, 8 round per clip, effective range of 500 yards in daylight, maybe 100 yards in jungle darkness. He arranged the magazines in careful rows along a fallen log, positioned so he could grab them without looking. He cleared fields of fire, cutting away ferns that might obscure his sight lines. He found 3 different firing positions, each offering slightly different angles down the slope, and memorized a path between them. If he stayed in one position too long, Japanese gunners would zero in on his muzzle flash. He would have to move constantly, shoot and relocate, never fire more than 2 clips from the same spot. The jungle returned to silence. Wilson checked his watch. 0320 hours. The mortars had stopped 30 minutes ago. Standard doctrine said the infantry assault would come 30 to 60 minutes after the mortars lifted, which meant he had maybe 30 minutes before they started climbing. He used the time to study the slope below him. The moon was 3/4 full, filtered through cloud cover, providing just enough light to see shapes and movement but not details. The slope was steep, maybe 40 degrees, covered in dense vegetation that would slow in advance but also provide concealment. Wilson identified 3 likely approach routes, natural paths where the undergrowth was thinner and the footing more stable. If he were leading the assault, those are the routes he would use. He was right. The first movement came at 0343 hours. A subtle shifting in the vegetation, about 60 yards downslope, visible only because Wilson had been staring at that exact spot for 20 minutes. His eyes had adjusted fully to the darkness now, and he had learned to see the jungle not as a solid mass, but as layers of shadow and depth. Something was moving in the middle layer, roughly man-height, moving slowly and deliberately. Wilson watched for 30 seconds, confirming, not an animal. The movement was too controlled, too purposeful. Human. Then he saw a second shape and a third. They were advancing in a skirmish line, about 10 yards apart, using the vegetation for cover. Wilson let them come. Every instinct screamed to fire immediately, but his deer hunting experience overrode panic. In the Oregon forest, an early shot meant a lost animal vanishing into thick brush. You waited for the certain kill, the moment when a target was fully visible and the range was close enough to guarantee accuracy. He waited until the lead Japanese soldier was 40 yards away, clearly visible in a small clearing where the moonlight broke through the canopy. Then he fired. The M1 Garand's distinctive crack shattered the jungle silence. The lead soldier dropped instantly, the round taking him center mass. Wilson didn't wait to confirm the kill. He shifted his aim left, found a second shape, fired. Shifted right, fired again. 3 shots, 3 targets down. Then he rolled to his left, moving to his second firing position 10 yards away, even as return fire ripped to the ferns where he had been lying. Japanese rifles, at least a dozen of them, firing blind at his muzzle flash. But Wilson was already gone, already settling into his next position, already searching the slope for new targets. The Japanese had expected resistance. They had expected rifle fire from multiple positions, the standard defense of a dug-in platoon. What they got was something different and confusing. Fire coming from one position, then another, with a precision and timing that suggested multiple riflemen coordinating their shots. But the volume of fire was wrong. Too few shots. Too much silence between engagements. Their officers tried to make sense of it, shouting orders in Japanese, redirecting squads toward suspected firing positions. But every time they concentrated fire on one spot, the American rifle would crack from a completely different angle, and another man would fall. Wilson fell into a rhythm. Shoot, move, reload. Never more than 2 aimed shots from one position. Never stay still longer than 20 seconds. He used every piece of cover the ridge offered, every fallen log and depression and standing tree. His childhood hunting experience guided him, the same patient stalking that had taught him how to move through forests without sound, how to read terrain, how to anticipate where a target would appear. But this was different from deer. These targets shot back, and there were so many of them. By 0400 hours, Wilson estimated he had fired 60 rounds and dropped at least 15 Japanese soldiers. But the assault wasn't slowing. If anything, it was intensifying. The Japanese had committed serious forces to this attack. At least 2 full companies as intelligence had warned. They were probing the entire ridge line now, trying to find weak points, trying to flank his positions. Wilson heard movement on his right flank. Too close, maybe 20 yards away. He grabbed one of his fragmentation grenades, pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, and threw it blind into the vegetation. The explosion was immediate and close enough to shower him with dirt and shredded leaves. Screams followed, then silence. He didn't know how many the grenade had hit, and he didn't have time to care. Movement on his left now, more soldiers trying to work around his position. The next hour became a blur of muzzle flashes, and running and reloading. Wilson stopped thinking in coherent thoughts. His mind reduced the target assessment and triggered discipline. Shape in the vegetation. Estimate range. Lead the target if moving. Fire. Confirm drop. Move. Reload while moving. Find new position. Search for new target. Repeat. His hands moved automatically, ejecting empty clips, slamming in fresh magazines, working the rifle's action with mechanical precision. His shoulder ached from the Garand's recoil. His ears rang from the constant gunfire. His lungs burned from the exertion of sprinting between positions while carrying full combat gear. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop, because he could hear them now. Japanese voices in the darkness, closer than before, coordinating their approach, realizing that they were facing a single defender and adjusting their tactics accordingly. At 0445 hours, Wilson ran out of loaded magazines. He had fired 16 of his 18 magazines, roughly 130 rounds, and the Japanese were still coming. He fell back to his final fallback position, a small depression near the ridge's highest point, and began frantically reloading magazines by hand, thumbing rounds from loose ammunition he had scavenged earlier. His hands shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. He fumbled around, watched it roll away into the darkness, cursed silently, and kept loading. He needed to be faster. They were close now. He could hear their footsteps, the rustle of equipment, the harsh breathing of men climbing a steep slope. A figure appeared at the ridgeline, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. Wilson dropped the magazine he was loading, raised his rifle with only 3 rounds in it, and fired. The figure fell backward. Another appeared immediately after, and Wilson fired again. His rifle pinged empty, the clip ejecting automatically. He snatched up the magazine he had been loading, slammed it home, and fired at a third figure. That man fell too, but now there were more, multiple soldiers cresting the ridge simultaneously, and Wilson knew with absolute certainty that this was the moment. They had finally massed enough force to overwhelm him. He would get maybe 10 more shots before they closed the distance. He prepared to die fighting. Then the mortars started. Not Japanese mortars. American mortars. Heavy 81mm rounds impacting on the slope below the ridge, walking up from the valley floor in precise barrage that could only mean forward observers had called in fire support. The Japanese assault staggered, soldiers diving for cover or running back down the slope away from the explosive impacts. Wilson used the confusion to reload completely, slamming in a fresh magazine and stuffing his pockets with loose rounds. The mortar fire continued for 3 minutes, a sustained bombardment that churned the jungle slope into smoking craters and shredded vegetation. When it stopped, the Japanese assault had broken. Wilson could see them retreating, dragging wounded, abandoning equipment in their haste to escape the killing zone. But Wilson knew this wasn't over. Mortars could break an assault, but they couldn't hold ground. The Japanese would reorganize and come again. He checked his watch. 0503 hours. Dawn was still 40 minutes away. He had maybe 15 minutes before they tried again. He was right again. The second assault came at 0520 hours, and this time the Japanese changed tactics. Instead of a broad skirmish line advancing slowly, they came in a concentrated rush, 30 or 40 men charging straight up the center approach route, counting on speed and numbers to overwhelm the defender before he could inflict serious casualties. It was a sound tactic. Against a single rifleman, mass and momentum would almost certainly succeed. But Wilson had been waiting for exactly this. He had repositioned during the lull, moving to a spot that offered an enfilade angle on the center approach route. When the Japanese charged, they exposed their flank to his firing position. Wilson fired as fast as he could work the trigger, not bothered with precision shots now, just putting rounds into a mass of running men. The Garand semi-automatic action allowed a sustained rate of fire that a bolt-action rifle could never match. 8 rounds, ping, reload. 8 rounds, ping, reload. He went through 4 magazines in less than 90 seconds, 32 rounds into a target-rich environment where missing was almost impossible. The charge faltered, then broke, survivors diving into cover or fleeing back down the slope. Wilson didn't know how many he had hit. The slope was a confusion of fallen bodies and wounded men screaming in Japanese. He estimated at least a dozen casualties, maybe more. The jungle fell silent again. Wilson reloaded mechanically, his hands working independently of his exhausted mind. He was down to 6 full magazines now, 48 rounds, plus maybe 30 loose rounds in his pockets. 78 rounds total. He had started the night with 900 rounds. He had fired more than 800 bullets in less than 3 hours, maintaining a rate of fire and accuracy that seemed impossible even to him. His rifle barrel was hot enough to burn skin. His shoulder was bruised purple from recoil. His fingers were bleeding from loading magazines in the dark. But he was still alive, and the Japanese were still below the ridge. At 0545 hours, the sky began to lighten. Not true dawn yet, but the pre-dawn glow that turns the jungle from black to gray to green. Wilson could see the slope clearly now, see the full extent of the carnage. Bodies everywhere, at least 40 that he could count, probably more hidden in the thick vegetation. Equipment scattered across the slope, rifles and packs and helmets. The Japanese had paid a terrible price for this ridge, and they had nothing to show for it, but they were still out there. Wilson could see movement at the base of the slope, soldiers regrouping in the tree line, officers organizing for another attempt. They would come again. They had to. They had committed too much force, taken too many casualties, to give up now. Japanese doctrine didn't allow for retreat after losses like this. They would make one more push, throw everything they had left at the ridge, counting on the fact that the American defender must be nearly out of ammunition by now. They were right about the ammunition. What they didn't know was that Harold Wilson had no intention of dying on this ridge after surviving the night. The third assault began at 0558 hours, and it was different from the others. No probing advance, no careful tactics. Just a mass attack. Every available man rushing the ridge simultaneously from multiple directions. A desperate all-or-nothing gamble to overwhelm the position before full daylight arrived. Wilson saw them coming and knew immediately that he couldn't stop this. Too many targets, too many approach routes, not enough ammunition. He would kill 10, maybe 15, and then they would be on top of him. He made his decision in 2 seconds. He grabbed his last grenade, the thermite grenade he had been saving, and threw it at the largest ammunition pile he had collected from the dead. Then he ran, sprinting along the ridge toward the rear, toward the American lines 200 yards away. Behind him, the thermite grenade ignited with a white-hot flare, setting off the ammunition stockpile in a series of explosions that sent rounds cooking off in every direction. The Japanese advance hesitated, soldiers diving for cover, thinking they were under fire from a new weapon. That hesitation bought Wilson 30 seconds. It was enough. He crashed through the jungle, no longer caring about noise or concealment, just running for his life. Behind him, he heard Japanese voices shouting, heard them crest a ridge and discover the abandoned positions. But by then, Wilson was already sliding down the rear slope, already into the American perimeter, already surrounded by shocked soldiers who had heard the all-night battle and assumed everyone on the ridge was dead. The sun broke over the jungle at 0612 hours. American reinforcements, a full company that had been held in reserve, advanced up the ridge and found it littered with Japanese casualties, but no living enemy soldiers. The Japanese forces had withdrawn, their assault broken, their losses unsustainable. The ridge was secure. The supply route was safe. The battalion's left flank had held. Harold Wilson sat against a tree trunk, drinking water from a canteen someone had handed him, and tried to count how many magazines he had left. 3. 24 rounds. He had started with 900 rounds and held off what post-action intelligence would later estimate as nearly 200 Japanese soldiers for 3.5 hours. Alone, the mathematics of it didn't make sense. By every calculation, every tactical analysis, every piece of conventional military wisdom, what Wilson had done was impossible. But he had done it anyway. The official after-action report credited the successful defense to accurate mortar support and effective use of terrain. Wilson's name appeared exactly once, in a list of personnel present during the engagement. No medals were recommended. No commendations filed. Wilson returned to his logistics company the next day, went back to loading supply trucks, and never spoke about that night unless directly asked. When he did talk about it, years later, he described it not as heroism but as simple necessity. Someone had to hold the ridge. He happened to be the one there, so he held it. What the official reports didn't capture, what no tactical analysis could explain, was how Wilson had managed such sustained accuracy under extreme stress. The answer lay not in his military training, which had been minimal, but in those childhood years hunting deer in Oregon forests. He had learned patience there, learned to wait for the perfect shot, learned to read terrain and anticipate movement. He had learned that panic misses and calm kills. That training, absorbed unconsciously over years of hunting, became the foundation for a defense that saved 800 men from encirclement and possible annihilation. The Japanese commanders who survived that night wrote their own reports, though these weren't discovered until after the war when Allied intelligence officers examined captured documents. Those reports described a heavily defended American position, manned by at least a platoon of expert riflemen supported by automatic weapons and perfectly coordinated mortar fire. No Japanese officer who fought at that ridge believed they had faced a single defender. The volume of fire, the shifting positions, the precise targeting, all suggested a well-trained unit executing a textbook defense. When they learned the truth years later, some Japanese veterans refused to believe it, insisting the American records must be wrong or deliberately misleading. But Harold Wilson knew the truth, and so did the 800 men who woke up on the morning of September 15th, 1943, to discover they were still alive because one replacement soldier from Oregon had decided that impossible didn't mean it couldn't be done. Wilson survived the war. He returned to Oregon, worked in the lumber industry, married, raised 3 children, and died in 1987 at the age of 66. His obituary mentioned that he was a World War II veteran, but included no details about his service. His family knew he had fought in New Guinea, but didn't know about the ridge until a military historian contacted them in 1992, researching obscure defensive actions in the Pacific Theater. The historian had found the after-action reports, cross-referenced Japanese unit records, and pieced together what had actually happened that September night. He tried to get Wilson's actions officially recognized, submitted paperwork for a posthumous medal, and was told that insufficient documentation existed to support the claim. Too much time had passed. Too many witnesses were dead. The official record couldn't be amended without multiple corroborating testimonies. So Harold Wilson remained officially forgotten, one more name and one more unit roster. His actions reduced to a single line in a tactical report that nobody reads today. But the Ridge remembered. For the rest of the New Guinea campaign, American soldiers referred to it as Wilson's Ridge, though that name never appeared on official maps. Japanese soldiers, when they spoke of it all, called it the Ridge of Ghosts, believing it was defended by the spirits of dead Americans seeking revenge. Neither side understood that it had been defended by something much simpler and much rarer than ghosts or platoons. It had been defended by one ordinary man who refused to accept that survival was impossible. The lessons from Wilson's stand are uncomfortable for military tacticians because they defy systematization. You cannot train someone to do what Wilson did. You cannot write doctrine that explains how one rifleman holds off 200 attackers. You cannot create a curriculum that teaches that level of sustained combat performance under extreme stress. What Wilson accomplished falls outside the boundaries of reproducible military science. It was personal, individual, unrepeatable. Yet understanding why Wilson succeeded offers insights into combat effectiveness that transcend specific battles or campaigns. First, his civilian hunting experience proved more valuable than extensive military training would have been. He brought skills developed over years of practical experience, Skills had been refined through trial and error in real environments. Military training, no matter how intensive, cannot fully replicate the judgment and instinct developed through sustained real-world practice. Second, Wilson's decision to stay was emotional rather than tactical. He didn't calculate odds or analyze options. He simply refused to abandon men who depended on that ridge being held. That emotional commitment provided motivation that pure tactical reasoning couldn't match. Third, Wilson fought within his limitations. He never tried to use the bar he had scavenged because he wasn't trained on it and didn't trust his ability to employ it effectively. He stuck with the M1 Garand, a weapon he understood completely. He didn't try to defend the entire ridge simultaneously, but instead create a defense in depth using constant movement and position changes. He recognized what he could and couldn't do, and built his offense around realistic self-assessment rather than heroic overreach. That pragmatic understanding of his own capabilities allowed him to maximize effectiveness within genuine constraints. Fourth, Wilson's success was partly luck. The Japanese mortar fire, devastating as it was, happened to miss him. The American mortar support arrived at exactly the right moment to break the first assault. The Japanese chose to attack at night, when Wilson's familiarity with jungle movement gave him an advantage over soldiers advancing through unfamiliar terrain. Any of these factors could have gone differently, and Wilson would have died in the first hour. Acknowledging luck's role doesn't diminish Wilson's actions, but contextualizes them within the larger chaos of combat, where skill and chance intertwine unpredictably. The ridge itself was eventually abandoned as the campaign moved forward and the strategic situation changed. Today, it's just another anonymous jungle hillside in Papua New Guinea, unremarked and unvisited. The bodies were buried long ago, the fighting positions eroded by 70 years of tropical weather, the trees that Wilson used for cover long since fallen and rotted away. Nothing marks the location of that September night's battle. No monument, no plaque, no indication that anything significant happened there. But significance isn't measured by monuments. It's measured by consequences. 800 men lived because Harold Wilson stayed on that ridge. Those men went on to fight in other battles, and some of them survived the war and went home and had families. Those families had children, and those children had children. By now, thousands of people exist because Harold Wilson made a decision that defied logic and survival instinct. Their existence is his monument, though none of them know his name. Military historians studying defensive actions sometimes use Wilson's stand as a case study in what individuals can accomplish under extreme circumstances, though his name rarely appears in the analysis. The focus is usually on tactical lessons, on fields of fire and ammunition management and position selection. Those lessons are valid and worth teaching, but they miss the deeper truth of what happened on that ridge. Harold Wilson didn't save 800 men through superior tactics or brilliant strategy. He saved them through simple refusal to quit, through grinding determination to make every round count, through willingness to endure 3.5 hours of sustained terror, because the alternative was unacceptable. That kind of determination can't be taught in any military academy. It comes from somewhere deeper, from core personality traits formed long before military service. Wilson's upbringing in a lumber town, his experience hunting in dense forests, his fundamental stubbornness that made him stick with impossible tasks, all contributed to the man who held that ridge. The Army didn't create Harold Wilson. It just put him in a place where a specific combination of skills and personality became the difference between disaster and survival. Modern military technology has changed combat dramatically since 1943. Night vision equipment would have made Wilson's defensive tactics obsolete. Thermal imaging would have eliminated the concealment advantages he exploited. Communications equipment would have allowed real-time coordination of fires and reinforcements. In a contemporary setting, Wilson's situation would never have arisen because no commander would leave a critical position defended by a single soldier. Modern doctrine, modern equipment, and modern tactics have made Wilson-style individual stands largely unnecessary. Yet reading about Wilson's actions still resonates because the fundamental human question remains unchanged. What do you do when circumstances force you into an impossible situation? Do you calculate the odds and make the rational decision to preserve yourself? Or Do you ignore the mathematics and fight anyway because people depend on you? Wilson chose to fight, and that choice rippled forward through decades, affecting thousands of lives that would never know his name. If you want more stories of unsung heroes who change history in moments nobody remembers, subscribe. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The final irony of Harold Wilson's story is that it almost wasn't a story at all. If that military historian hadn't been researching obscure New Guinea actions in 1992, if he hadn't found the Japanese unit records that contradicted the American reports, if he hadn't contacted Wilson's family to verify details, the truth of what happened on that ridge would have died with the last combat veterans who witnessed it. Wilson himself never wrote about his experience, never sought recognition, never contacted veterans organizations or historians. He had done a job that needed doing, survived it, and moved on. The idea that his actions deserved special attention apparently never occurred to him. That modesty was typical of Wilson's generation, men who endured the Depression and fought the war and returned home to build lives without expecting applause or acknowledgement. They did what circumstances required, and they didn't consider that particularly remarkable. Modern sensibilities struggle with that mindset because we live in an era that emphasizes recognition and validation. But Wilson's generation operated under different assumptions. You did your duty because it was your duty, not because you expected reward. You helped others because they needed help, not because you wanted credit. You endured hardship because hardship was part of life, not because you expected compensation for suffering. Those assumptions shaped men who could do things like hold a ridge alone for 3.5 hours, not because they were heroes in the modern sense, but because they were practical men who addressed problems with available resources, no matter how inadequate those resources might be. Wilson had a rifle and ammunition, and a position to defend. That those resources were insufficient for the task was irrelevant. They were what he had. So he used them as effectively as possible until the situation changed. The broader context of Wilson's stand is worth noting. The New Guinea campaign was one of the war's most brutal theaters. Fought in terrain that ranged from impenetrable jungle to malarial swamp to mountain passes where mud and steep slopes made every movement an ordeal. Disease killed more men than combat. Supply lines were primitive and unreliable. Reinforcements arrived slowly, if at all. Soldiers fought in conditions that made the European theater look comfortable by comparison. In that context, Wilson's situation wasn't unique. Across New Guinea, hundreds of small unit actions occurred where isolated groups of soldiers held desperate positions against superior forces. Most of those actions ended badly, with positions overrun, and defenders killed or captured. Wilson's successful defense was the exception, not the rule. Yet even among successful defensive actions, Wilson's stand remained statistically extraordinary. Analysis of similar situations in the Pacific Theater shows that lone defenders almost never held positions for more than 30 to 40 minutes before being overwhelmed or forced to retreat. Wilson's 3.5-hour defense is an outlier so extreme that it initially caused analysts to suspect the records were wrong. Only the Japanese casualty reports, which couldn't be explained any other way, convinced skeptics that one man had actually inflicted that level of damage. The tactical explanation involves several factors. First, Wilson's use of constant movement prevented the Japanese from fixing his position and coordinating effective return fire. Second, his discipline in firing only aimed shots rather than spraying ammunition meant he maintained lethality throughout the engagement instead of running out of ammunition early. Third, his selection of firing positions with multiple withdrawal routes allowed him to disengage when situations became untenable. Fourth, his emotional control prevented panic when situations looked hopeless. Each of these factors was necessary but not sufficient. Only the combination of all four, sustained over 3.5 hours under extreme stress, explains the outcome. But tactical analysis only explains how Wilson succeeded. It does explain why he tried. The why is personal and ultimately unknowable. We know Wilson's unit had lost men in previous actions. We know he was aware that the battalion depended on the ridge being held. We know he was 22 years old and probably more capable of that kind of sustained effort than an older man would have been. But we don't know what thoughts went through his mind in that moment when he could have retreated but chose to stay. We don't know if he believed he could actually hold a position, or if he simply decided that trying was better than running. We don't know if he was afraid, or if the adrenaline and focus of combat suppressed fear. We only know what he did, not what he felt while doing it. That unknowability is frustrating for historians and analysts who want to understand and systematize extraordinary performance. But it's also fundamental to what makes Wilson's story compelling. He wasn't a character in a novel whose internal monologue we can read. He was a real person facing a real situation, making decisions based on information and emotions we can only guess at. The mystery of his motivation is part of what makes his actions remarkable. We see the outcome, we can reconstruct the actions, but we cannot fully understand the person. Harold Wilson died without ever fully explaining why he stayed on that ridge. His family asked him about it once, years after the war. His answer was characteristically brief. Someone had to hold it. That 6-word explanation is simultaneously completely adequate and entirely insufficient. It explains his decision without revealing anything about the person who made it, but perhaps that's appropriate. Wilson never thought of himself as special or extraordinary. He was a man who found himself in a situation and did what seemed necessary. The fact that what seemed necessary turned out to be nearly impossible didn't change his assessment of the obligation. In the end, Harold Wilson's story isn't really about tactics or weapons or combat effectiveness. It's about the gap between what we think humans are capable of under stress and what specific individuals actually accomplish when circumstances demand it. Wilson shouldn't have been able to hold that ridge. Every analysis says it was impossible, but he didn't know it was impossible, or if he did know, he didn't care. He had a job to do, and he did it until it was done. That simple determination, repeated across 3.5 hours of sustained combat, saved 800 lives and changed the outcome of a campaign. They said survival was impossible. The mathematics proved it. The doctrine confirmed it. The tactical analysis supported it. One man with 900 rounds couldn't hold a position against 200 attackers. The conclusion was obvious and inevitable. Harold Wilson held it anyway.